For 23 years, the case looked like a burglary that had gone wrong. A young nurse was found dead inside her home in Van Nuys. A stereo had been pulled from a cabinet. A car was missing. A glass door was shattered. The scene gave detectives a story they could understand quickly. Someone had broken in. Sherri Rasmussen had surprised them, and violence had exploded. But inside that scene was one detail that refused to fit. On Sherri's arm, investigators found what looked like a bite mark. That mark was preserved, sealed away, and almost forgotten. Years passed. Detectives retired. Evidence sat in storage. The woman who killed Sherri did not run from Los Angeles. She did not vanish. She did not build a fake identity. She stayed close to the case in the strangest way possible. She became a veteran detective inside the Los Angeles Police Department. And in 2009, when two lefty detectives brought her into an interview room, they were not speaking to an ordinary suspect. They were speaking to one of their own. Her name was Stephanie Lazarus. And when they asked her about the dead woman, she acted as if the memory was barely there. The 24th of February, 1986 began as an ordinary Monday inside a condominium on Balboa Street in Van Nuys. Sherri Rasmussen was 29 years old. She worked as a nurse at a Glendale hospital. She was married to John Rattin, and the marriage was still new. They had been married only a few months. That morning, John left for work at about 7:20. Sherri did not go in. She called in sick. At first, that did not mean anything. People get sick. People stay home. But as the day moved forward, the silence around that apartment became harder to explain. John tried calling her. Sherri's sister tried calling her. The phone rang and no one answered. At about 9:45 that morning, a neighbor noticed something odd. The garage to the condominium was open, and there were no cars inside. Later, around noon, that same neighbor received Sherri's purse from two men who believed it had been found nearby. At the time, it looked like another piece of a robbery. The day kept moving. No one knew that inside the condominium the real story had already happened. When John came home around 6 p.m., he saw the garage door open. Sherri's Bindu was gone. There was broken glass in the driveway from a shattered sliding glass patio door. Inside, stereo equipment had been pulled out and stacked near the door. A drawer had been dumped. It looked messy enough to tell one story, but not messy enough to make that story feel complete. Then John found Cher on the living room floor. The first investigation moved in the direction the scene seemed to point. Missing car, broken glass, disturbed property, a young woman home alone. It looked like burglars had come in and been surprised. That theory would shape the case for years. And it was wrong. The physical scene was violent, but it was also strangely controlled. Sherri had been shot 3 times in the chest. The wounds were fatal. There were injuries showing a struggle. Broken pieces of fingernail were found near the front door. There were marks on her wrists, injuries to her face and head, and signs that she fought hard. Near her body, investigators found a quilt with bullet holes and gunshot residue. Later prosecutors would argue that the quilt had been used to muffle the shots. That detail mattered. A random burglar usually wants speed. In and out, take property. Lee. But this scene suggested someone had taken time, had brought control, had known the situation, and had staged what came after. The stereo equipment looked staged. The car being taken looked staged. The broken glass looked staged. And the home itself was not an easy target. It was inside a gated complex centrally located with an alarm system. The killer did not clear out the home. Valuable property was not stripped. The Ningbu was later recovered only a few miles away, not destroyed, not stripped, not sold. If this was burglary, it was an unusually strange burglary. But in 1986, the strange parts were not enough to break the theory. Investigators collected what they could: fingerprints, hair bled-like, stains, fingernail material, swabs from the bite mark. Some tests were done. Some evidence did not match the obvious suspects. Some evidence simply sat. The most important piece of the case was placed in storage. It would wait there for nearly 2 decades. To understand why the case eventually turned toward Stephanie Lazarus, the story has to move backward. Before Sherri married John Rattin, John had known Stephanie. John and Stephanie met in college. They dated casually, and their relationship continued after school. John later testified that he did not consider Stephanie his girlfriend, but there had been a sexual relationship between them. Then John met Sherri Rasmussen. In 1985, John and Sherri became engaged. According to the court record, when Stephanie learned about the engagement, she was devastated. She called John, crying, and asked him to come to her condominium. When he arrived, she told him she was in love with him. She asked him to reconsider. The relationship between John and Sherri continued. Later, Stephanie went to the hospital where Sherri worked and confronted her. That confrontation is one of the most important moments before the murder. It meant Stephanie knew Sherri existed. It meant Sherri was not just a name. It meant the two women had been face to face. John and Sherri married in November 1985. 3 months later, Sherri was dead. At the time, Stephanie Lazarus was a Leip officer. She had entered the academy in 1983 and graduated in 1984. People who knew her described her as strong, aggressive, persistent, athletic, and an expert-level shooter. She was not someone who would be easy to overpower. She also owned a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson Model 49 revolver, a 5-shot model with an approximately 2-inch barrel. The detail would matter later because the ammunition used in the killing was the type Leip officers were required to use, and trial testimony connected the likely weapon type to a 2-inch barrel revolver. Less than 2 weeks after Sherri was killed, Stephanie reported that her revolver had been stolen from her car. That report did not solve the case in 1986. But years later, it would sit beside the DNA evidence like a second shadow. The first version of the case had a simple shape: burglary, surprise, murder. But simple stories can become dangerous when they are wrong. For years, the Rasmussen family pushed back. Sherri's father did not believe a random burglary explained what happened. He believed the investigation had missed something obvious. The scene felt personal. The violence felt personal. The staged robbery felt like someone trying to steer police away. But suspicion is not proof. The case did not move. Evidence remained in storage. The bite mark swabs taken in 1986 were kept in the coroner's evidence room. Technology changed. DNA testing became more powerful. Cold cases across the country began reopening because old biological evidence could now say what witnesses never could. In December 2000, Fort Leip PD's cold case unit reopened Sherri's case and asked the coroner's office to locate the bite mark sample. It was still there. That is the moment the case begins to turn. Not with a confession, not with a witness who suddenly remembered everything, not with a dramatic chase, with a tube of old evidence stored for years, waiting for science to catch up. In 2005, a criminalist examined material from the bite mark swabs. Under the microscope, she saw epithelial cells, the kind found in saliva. The testing showed two profiles: a minor profile consistent with Sherri and a complete major profile from a female. The major profile was uploaded into a national database. No match? That could have been the end of the new lead. A DNA profile without a name is powerful, but it is also silent. It tells investigators that someone was there. It does not tell them who. Then, in 2009, investigators changed strategy. Instead of asking the database to find a stranger, they began asking a different question. What women had a reason to hurt Sherri Rasmussen? The old relationship came back into focus. Stephanie Lazarus was no longer just an ex from John Roetten's past. She was an Leip detective. She had known John. She had been upset about Sherri. She had confronted Sherri. She had owned a gun consistent with the prosecution's theory, and she was still inside the same police department that had investigated the murder. Investigators needed her DNA. They did not begin by asking. They watched her, waited for her to discard something, and recovered a drink cup and straw. The partial DNA profile from the cup and straw matched the major profile from the bite mark. After 23 years, the bite mark had a name. On the 5th of June 2009, detectives Gregory Stearns and Dan Jeremiel interviewed Stephanie Lazarus. This is the part of the case that made it explode online years later, not just because of what was said, but because of who was sitting in the chair. Stephanie was not a civilian who had never seen a police interview. She had spent decades in law enforcement. She understood how detectives build pressure. She understood when a question is casual and when it is not. She knew that memory can be a shield if you use it carefully. The detectives began with John Ruetten. Stephanie repeated his name as if trying to remember. Then she said she had gone to school with him. She described him as a close friend, then acknowledged they had dated. When asked how long, she drifted into other details. His age, his family, when he graduated, when she met her husband. The court later summarized her answers as evasive. That word is important. She did not simply deny everything. She adjusted. She moved slowly. She gave herself exits. Had she met Sherri? At first she said she did not know, maybe she may have. Then, as the questions continued, she seemed to remember more. Maybe Sherri worked at a hospital. Maybe Stephanie had gone there. Maybe they had spoken once or twice. Had she known where John and Sherri lived? At first, no. Then maybe she had known. Maybe she had been there in some context she could not recall. Had she ever gotten into a physical fight with Sherri Rasmussen? Her answer was not a clean. She said that if it happened, she honestly did not remember it. She said it was not ringing a bell. That is a remarkable answer to a remarkable question. Because the detectives were not asking about a parking ticket, they were asking whether she had physically fought with a woman who had been murdered. And by the end, Stephanie said something that sounded almost like the center of the case pushing through the fog. She was shocked that somebody would be saying she did this. She said in substance, "We had a fight, and so I went and killed her." The detectives already had the DNA. The interview was not the beginning of suspicion. It was the final room before the arrest. At trial, prosecutors built the case in layers. First came the relationship. Stephanie loved John. John chose Sherri. Stephanie was devastated. She confronted Sherri. Her own writing showed distress over John, including journal entries about seeing his car, leaving a note, watching it, and struggling to concentrate after learning he was getting married. Second came the opportunity and capability. Stephanie was off duty on the day Sherri was killed. She was physically strong. She had police training. She knew firearms. She owned a gun that fit the broad weapon theory and then reported it stolen less than 2 weeks later. Third came the stage scene. The home looked like a burglary, but the details were wrong. Valuable property was not really taken in a normal way. The envelope was abandoned nearby. The struggle appeared focused and personal. Prosecutors argued the burglary was a mask. Fourth came the science. The bite mark contained saliva evidence. The major female DNA profile matched Stephanie Lazarus. Later independent testing matched her profile at 1.5 loci with a probability estimate so large that it became one of the most memorable facts in the case. The defense attacked the case from several directions. They pointed to other unknown fingerprints and DNA at the scene. They challenged the passage of time. They challenged parts of the firearm theory. They called witnesses who described Stephanie as nonviolent. They argued that decades of delay had damaged the defense because memories faded and evidence was lost. That matters for the way this story should be told. This was not a case where every single piece of evidence pointed in the same direction without dispute. It was a case where the prosecution's theory became powerful because several independent lines converged: motive, access, staging, weapon circumstances, evasive interview behavior, and above all, DNA from the bite mark. The jury convicted Stephanie Lazarus of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to 25 years to life, plus 2 years for the weapons enhancement. In 2015, the California Court of Appeal affirmed the judgment. One of the hardest parts of this case is that the answer was not impossible to imagine in 1986. The Rasmussens family had concerns early. The scene did not feel like a normal burglary. Sherri had already reported a confrontation with Stephanie. John knew Stephanie had been upset. The personal angle existed. But an investigation is not a story where the audience gets to see every clue arranged in order. It is pressure, workload, assumptions, hierarchy, and human judgment. Once the burglary frame settled over the scene, every detail had to fight its way back out. The stereo equipment by the door looked like a clue to theft. The missing bean looked like a clue to escape. The broken glass looked like forced entry. But later, each of those details could be read another way. The stereo equipment could be staging. The tubing could be a prop in the staging. The broken glass could be a late attempt to sell the wrong story. That is why the case is so disturbing from an investigative point of view. It shows how the first explanation can become a trap. Once a crime is labeled as one thing, every later decision can quietly bend around that label. The bite mark did not fit the burglary story neatly. The violence did not fit it neatly. The lack of meaningful theft did not fit it neatly. But the theory survived long enough for the case to go cold. And while it was cold, Stephanie Lazarus built a career. She was not hiding from police work. She was doing police work. She became part of the professional world that knows how to preserve evidence, how to question suspects, how to rate reports, how to read a room, and how to keep control. That creates the central irony of the case. The thing that made her look unlikely to many people in 1986 was the same thing that made the story unforgettable in 2009. She was a cop. A responsible true crime story also has to say what the evidence did not prove. The prosecution did not present the murder weapon. Stephanie had reported her revolver stolen, and experts challenged parts of the firearms theory. Other unidentified fingerprints and traces of DNA existed in the broader scene. Decades had passed, and faded memories were a real issue. Those facts do not erase the conviction. They explain why the case had to be built carefully. The case was not one magic clue. It was a stack of answers to the same question. Why would a burglar bring or use a method that looked like controlled violence? Why would so little of value disappear? Why would the bite mark contain a female DNA profile later match the Stephanie? Why would Stephanie have a documented emotional history around John and Sherri? Why would her gun be reported stolen shortly after the murder? Why would her 2009 interview answer shift from not knowing to maybe knowing to maybe remembering? Each question alone could be argued. Together they formed the shape the jury accepted. And that is also why the interrogation is so powerful to watch. The detectives were not trying to solve the whole case in that room. They were watching how a trained investigator reacted when the past was placed in front of her piece by piece. Not all suspense is loud. Sometimes it is a suspect repeating a name as if it is far away. Sometimes it is a pause before the word maybe. Sometimes it is a detective who already knows the answer asking the question anyway. The reason this case keeps drawing viewers is not only the murder, it is the inversion. The person eventually convicted was not a stranger hiding outside the system. She was inside the system. She knew how police think. She knew how investigations move. She knew what questions mean. That creates a special kind of suspense. When an ordinary suspect hesitates, viewers read fear. When a detective hesitates, viewers read calculation. Every pause becomes a clue. Every maybe becomes a strategy. Every forgotten detail feels too convenient to ignore. There is also the long delay. In 1986, the killer could walk away from the scene. In 2009, a discarded cup and straw could pull the past back into the present. That is the engine of the story. The past is not gone. It is preserved. The bite mark was preserved. The gun report was preserved. The journals were preserved. The interview was preserved. And the false burglary story, the one that once seemed to explain everything, eventually became part of the evidence that something was wrong. The case did not end when the handcuffs went on. It moved into trial appeal and later parole proceedings. According to Humility's Los Angeles report published on the 12th of February 2025, Stephanie Lazarus was denied parole for a second time. Nuys reported that she would be eligible again in 2028, while also noting the possibility of an earlier petition if circumstances changed. That is the public status as of that report. But the center of the case remains the 24th of February 1986. A woman stayed home sick. Her husband left for work. The phone went unanswered. The scene was made to look like one kind of crime. And for 23 years that story held. Then the evidence that had been waiting in storage finally spoke. It said the killer had not been an unknown burglar. It said the case had been much closer to home. and it led detectives to a room where the suspect across the table knew exactly how interviews work. That is what makes this case so chilling. Not just that Stephanie Lazarus was caught, but that for more than 2 decades she wore the same badge as the people who were supposed to find her.